It is my very great pleasure to stand before this audience once again, not only to continue the exploration that I began 2 years ago, but which is, I fear, in some respects, still a little bit tentative, but also because I continue to see the profoundly scholarly and intellectual value in the continued connection between the Masonic community and Brock University. Through this lecture series, we also hope to draw the larger community into Brock, and so I'm also very pleased to welcome Brock students and faculty and members of the Niagara community. Opening up the often cloistered research that goes on in an institution like Brock is essential to keeping that research alive. And the Sankey Lecture Series is, to my thinking, a flagship event for that purpose. It is my honor to participate, however humbly, to the stellar roster of scholars that have stood here before me, including my colleague, Renée N. Thank you very much. This afternoon, though, I would like to begin at a place not very far from here, Beaver Dams. This is where one of the most celebrated victories of the War of 1812 took place, celebrated, I might add, by the British, not by the Americans. Seemed a suitable way to begin today. In June of 1813, a column of over 500 American soldiers were ambushed at Beaver Dams by native Mohawk warriors, and then they were taken prisoner by a much smaller detachment of British soldiers. The Americans had set out from Fort George, the westernmost British post on Lake Ontario, which they had triumphantly captured just a few weeks before. On their way, they stopped in the village of Queenston, where the men billeted in the homes of the town's inhabitants. The officers took advantage of the hospitality of a young wife and mother by the name of Laura Secord. Secord's husband, James, as some of you may know, was a Freemason. In fact, according to some stories, he first met Laura after her father, who was also a Freemason, met him at a lodge meeting and thought him a likely prospect as a son-in-law. It was while the American soldiers were taking respite in her home that Laura Secord overheard their plans of invasion. Her husband, who was recovering from wounds sustained during the Battle of Queenston Heights, was unable to act, and so Secord did the deed, traveling over 20 miles to the post of Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon, who was also a Freemason, and she warned him of the attack and thereby contributed conspicuously to the victory at Beaver Dams. It was during the exchange at Beaver Dams that an extraordinary thing happened, and one that sets the stage for us today in our consideration of Freemasons and the War of 1812. During this battle, Masonic brother John P. Clement of the 8th Regiment of Foot, he was attached to the regiment's lodge, noticed a wounded American officer who was about to be scalped at the hands of the Mohawk warriors. When the American officer gave a Masonic sign of distress, Clement intervened. In a very romantic and colorful account of that moment, we are told that Clement, quote, with fleet foot, for he was young and active, rushed to the aid of his brother. He blocked the uplifted hand of the warrior, whose bright blade glistened in the morning sun, descending to its deadly work, and he threw the Indian on his back, ordering him off. He then called an orderly and had the American officer taken away safely as prisoner. Our story does not end here, however. Many months later, Clement himself was taken prisoner by the Americans and was sent to a jail in New York State. Shortly after his arrival, he was visited by the officer in charge of the jail and discovered it was the same officer, that fellow Mason, whose life he'd saved at Beaver Dams. That night, we are told, Clement was visited by a friend who intimated that, quote, at early dawn, the jail door would be on the latch, and that outside, a horse wagon and driver would be in waiting to convey him as quickly as possible to the frontier. This incident of one Mason assisting another, defying the tempers and demands of the battlefield to recognize the ties of the craft, was not unique. There are many similar stories, dozens of stories, of men whose lives were saved, whose freedom was secured through their Masonic connections. It was not only through the saving of lives either, which form a consistent and quiet sort of counter-narrative to the War of 1812. When taken prisoner, many soldiers, both American and British, found their physical discomforts lessened significantly. Their food got better if it was made known that they were members of the fraternity. Often, Masons stepped in to protect the property of fellow brothers as well, particularly the regalia and the jewels belonging to the lodges. When the Americans had captured the village of Newark, for example, in 1813, they commenced a common and, for the civilians, an horrific tradition of the war, sacking and pillaging. However, when the Americans discovered Masonic jewels in one of the houses, they not only left the house intact, but posted sentries at the door. British Mason soldiers behaved this way as well. On the 30th of July, 1813, the British conducted a raid on Plattsburgh, New York. This was a key naval and military site for the Americans located on the shores of Lake Champlain. A later battle here in 1814, which you see depicted in this painting and cleverly called the Battle of Lake Champlain, has overshadowed this raid to a considerable degree. But before then, what the inhabitants remembered was this midsummer invasion. The town was confronted with a British flotilla that was loaded with about 1,400 troops. And according to one contemporary account, they, quote, landed at this place on Saturday afternoon and began the work of destruction, which lasted until Sunday at 10 o'clock. Although the commander of the invading force had, this correspondent wrote, assured the civil authority that the civil authority of the village that private property would be respected, yet these promises were no sooner made than violated. The invaders destroyed buildings, both public storehouses and military structures, as well as private homes. They took all that they could carry, as well as the things they could not carry. Along with food, alcohol, and portable treasures, they stole or destroyed furniture, books, clocks, and crockery. Livestock was killed, civilians were assaulted, and our correspondent tells us the Masonic Hall was robbed of its records, its refreshments, and its jewels. However, the latter were returned. This is a notable yet common wartime occurrence, where invading forces would capture flags as treasures and cart off the belongings of civilians, a different status, a respect which transcended the war, applied to the objects of the craft. How should we interpret these actions and events? In the strictest, narrowest sense of war, these acts might be interpreted as treasonous. By aiding and abetting their enemies, letting prisoners escape, the men were cheating the unspoken and sometimes spoken rules of combat. Others, those who did not escape the bayonet, those whose treasures, great and small, were not spared the marauding grasp of invaders, soldiers who were left to molder in jails or die on battlefields, might have interpreted these acts as fundamentally unfair. Why should some good people be spared and not others? In the 19th century, the secrecy of the fraternity engendered enormous suspicion and anger, which was very likely compounded by the ways these men mobilized notions of brotherhood on the battlefield. In another sense, however, these acts might be more accurately said to demonstrate how some people, in this case Masonic people, rose above the chaos of war and resisted the artificial distinctions of nationality that were imposed upon them by their enemies, by their politicians, and by their military commanders. Membership in the fraternity made men, otherwise strangers, in this case now mortal enemies, familiar to one another. Within the body of a Freemason, whether American, Canadian, or British, and in a more limited sense, Native American, there were qualities worth saving and protected. There was a sense of trust that defied the propaganda of the war. There was the knowledge of oaths taken to give aid to a brother in distress. These acts, perhaps treasonous, perhaps unfair, and certainly unexpected, given how we usually understand how combatants behave during wartime, sit at the very heart of how these men practiced and understood the craft. It is this idea, this question, how the craft influenced behavior outside of the lodge room, that I'm particularly interested in understanding. The Freemasons were a formidable socio-political organization, spanning not just borders, but continents. It was a key tool of empire, as Jessica Harlan Jacobs so ably demonstrated a few years ago, and it was a functional element and an important element of American politics, as Stephen Bullock has equally well demonstrated. But beyond its organizational political influence, how was it a force for shaping men's characters and influencing their behavior? What might its effects have been in their daily lives, and how do we measure that influence, given the limitations of the historical record? This was, after all, a secret society. As military historian John Keegan admonishes, however, the very size of the question ought not to deter the historian from attempting an answer, and so I will attempt one. I am lucky in some ways that the landscape I have to explore this question is in fact the landscape of the War of 1812. Because it was war, because of the extraordinary upheaval and disruption that people experienced, we know more about this time. War is productive of death, destruction, and pain, but also paper. Journals, newspapers, reports, letters, memoirs, all of these things multiply and take on particular importance and poignancy in the aftermath. They tend to get preserved by people who believe they are part of something more urgent and consequential than the day-to-day routines of peacetime. So in that sense, I have a lot of stuff to work with. Of course, because it was war, I am also faced with the opposite reality. Most of the established lodges in the war zone closed their doors for the duration of the conflict, or they had their regular activities severely curtailed. At Amherstburg, for example, the news of Masonic brother General Hull's invasion on July 12th of 1812, which was the first incursion of the war, interrupted the local lodge meeting, and the brethren closed their doors permanently. Elsewhere along the Niagara frontier, where the war was the worst, the annual public processions and celebrations of St. John's Day, which are central to Masonic celebrations, and frequently also the most significant social events in many of these communities in both Canada and the United States, were almost wholly unheard of between 1812 and 1815. These circumstances in themselves are very strong evidence of the most significant effect that the war had on the practice of Freemasonry. As it was for those outside the craft, these 32 months were ones of upheaval, distraction, and disruption. For many people, that disruption continued well into the post-war period. More than one lodge never reopened its doors. Some had their lodges damaged or destroyed, their members killed. Worse still, the once easy movement of brothers across the border, which was a very frequent experience, for example, in Amherstburg, between Amherstburg and Detroit lodges, ceased. Sometimes permanently, often for more than a decade or more, the tradition of visiting across the border stopped. The culture of war, as the Brotherhood learned, was not conducive to the culture of Freemasonry. So what does it mean to speak of a culture of war? The events and processes, as we generally perceive them, are political and military, not cultural. Yet wars develop their own rhythms and expressions, which have very little to do with politics or military planning. They have everything to do with their historical environment, with the men fighting, with their relationships, their fears, their behavior, their perceptions of their enemies and of themselves. War itself, as an historical phenomenon, is also cultural, but in a broader sense. It is indeed the canvas on which commanders, kings, and princes devised their domestic and international political strategies. But it is also the arena in which cultural notions of manhood were tested, confirmed, and occasionally overwritten. The culture of the War of 1812 was just such an arena. Consideration of Freemasonry in that context provides us with a rich view of the complexity of men's lives and their perceptions of what their manhood meant. It can do so because it was an organization that was essentially about shaping and improving manhood. The Brotherhood presented a synchronous, harmonious experience with the experience of soldiering, whether on the battlefield or off of it, which is what I'd like to explore through this research. Understanding how the lessons of Freemasonry were lived in the everyday world of 1812 requires an appreciation of what Masonry's message was for individual members. It has been fairly well established what its appeal was. The fraternity, as one historian described it, offered a passport to convivial society. Lodge meetings were counterparts of domestic life, places of sociability and easy humor, of food and drink, friendship and social advancement. The fraternity's emphasis on charity meant that brothers might find relief in times of want, something that was essential in many of these emerging communities in the colonies. Their constitutions forbade the fractious and divisive subjects of religion and politics, so brothers could also find peace. The lodges eased transition from one strange place to another as the colonies were settled, and they became a focal point in emergent communities. The intrepid sailors who built Newark, for example, began first and reflecting, I think, a noble set of priorities with their tavern and their Freemasons' lodge. It was here in the Niagara Lodge that local balls were held, where the Agricultural Society found its meeting place, and some have suggested where Sir John Graves Simcoe, a prominent Freemason himself, held the earliest meetings to conduct the government of Upper Canada. But they were also much more than this. This benevolent and sociable appeal of the lodges was enhanced by their commitment to refining the moral and spiritual features of men's characters. They sought to educate in mathematics, natural sciences, philosophy, and history, and to teach manners and decorum. They were cultivating gentlemen who could speak in public, who knew how to keep records, to moderate their eating and drinking, and tying all of these things together, as Margaret Jacob argues, to show devotion to other citizens of the order. In essence, these lessons in civility, important as they were for providing men with the tools necessary for civic participation, were also about the production, refinement, and definition of manhood itself. As it concerns us here today in our appraisal of Freemasons during the War of 1812, we must also consider how the fraternity approached the issue of violence. On one hand, a violent act, the murder of Hiram Abiff, sits at the very center of Masonic ritual, facilitating its fundamental identity and history. The consolation of the story of Abiff's violent death, however, is not violence itself or the search for revenge. It is the inspiration which he and which his knowledge imparted to the men who discovered his corpse. Members of the Masonic order congregated around a fundamental pursuit of education, brotherhood, and peace. The violent act which inspired their fraternity was simultaneously contrary to its principles. According to Reverend and Masonic brother Alexander Spark of Quebec, just as one example, when men neglected their intellects, when they did not deliberately cultivate knowledge and understanding, the result was violence and discord. They became divided amongst themselves, he wrote, rude in their manners, hostile to their own species, ignorant and unsociable. Masonry, he insisted, brought light to this kind of chaos. Freemasonry's task, he proclaimed, was to teach men to perceive that they were formed for society and that there, in society, their nature can reach the highest perfection and happiness. Freemasonry bids them lay aside the fierceness of a hostile disposition and teacheth men of every nation, of every different faith, of every rank in life, overlooking the prejudices and distinctions which education or fortune may have established, to embrace one another like brethren, and to give the soul to harmony and love. At its heart, Freemasonry was a fraternity of peace. These sentiments, expressed by many more than Spark, suggest perhaps that we would be hard-pressed to find Masons in the armies and navies of those countries where the craft was common. However, the opposite is true. As the tales I told at the start of this talk suggest, barracks on both sides of the border, all of its ships were replete with the fraternity's members. Certainly when it comes to the officers, it is more surprising to discover that they were not Masons than that they were. As Grand Historian Michael Jenkins writes, war, famine, death, and destruction could coexist with the Masonic principles of charity to all and benevolence to friend and foe alike. The affinity between military service and the craft was a long-standing one, in fact, that reaches back into the earliest days of the Brotherhood. Soldiers felt very strongly about maintaining their Masonic affiliations while abroad, and nearly every regiment had at least one lodge in its ranks, and many had several. The membership lists of civilian lodges, moreover, in most of the communities throughout the war zone of 1812 also reveal a strong contingent of military men, whether British or American. This coexistence was possible and perhaps inevitable for several reasons. Boredom among the soldier, the spirituality and ritual of lodge experience, the pursuit of respectability in the Army and Navy, and the growing emphasis on political loyalty in conceptions of citizenship. And I'll talk about all four of these, but I'll begin with what I hope nobody is feeling right now, boredom. Accounts from soldiers stationed in North America long before the War of 1812 reveal that for soldiers stationed here in what many people saw as a backwater of empire, ennui was a persistent threat to men's well-being. The time passes very heavily, as Captain John Knox, who was stationed in Nova Scotia in the 1750s, wrote. And even though the War of 1812 presented soldiers with action, they still found themselves frustrated with boredom, particularly in the winter months. As we have learned horribly and firsthand this winter, cold weather is not conducive to much, let alone fighting. And between the late fall and early spring, combatants found themselves with little to do but drill, drink, and consume meager rations before even meager fires. As one American officer grouched about being stationed in Buffalo in the winter of 1814, we have nothing here, neither eating, drinking. I'm going to let you guys assume the content of that last word. My mom is in the audience. No fighting nor fiddling, neither society or wilderness enough to make us social. They also had little respite from the conditions. Most of the time they were cold and wet, and many of them complain about mosquitoes the size of chickens. For men like these, lucky enough to find themselves member of a lodge, and many did, the work conducted therein, the distraction, the intellectual stimulation, the sociability, the familiarity of the lodge room provided a welcome and important respite from the doldrums of duty. One officer described what he called the freshness and beauty of Freemasonry as being crucial for redeeming the monotony of his life and for keeping his mind active. Robert Gould, a Masonic historian concerned particularly with military lodges, what he referred to as the blending of the apron and the sword, noted that Freemasonry also carried a beneficial effect in soothing the angry passions of those soldiers and sailors who are ranged under its banner. The elaborate ritual aspects of the Brotherhood, its symbolic system, and its persistent reflection on what they called and still call the great architect of the universe, offered some and perhaps many men an outlet for their spiritual needs. In the British Army, moreover, it attracted men whose faith was essentially banned from military life. Until well into the 19th century, into the late 1830s, in fact, officers were required to be the members of the Church of England. No other faiths were allowed. And the only regular services provided, on paper at least, were to be provided by Anglicans. But within a Masonic lodge, men could regularly and openly acknowledge their faith in an institutional setting that deliberately and explicitly ignored denominational differences. Given the nature of their occupation, men employed in the work of war often found themselves engaged in explicitly sinful acts like killing. The importance of these spiritual outlets, these places of retreat, cannot be underestimated, even though they're little studied. Moreover, the charitable functions of the fraternity tended to lessen the effects of this inherently risky occupation. They had, through their membership, access to a global network of support that they could draw on in times of need, and not only in times of need such as that experienced by the American whose life was saved by Brother John Clement. Soldiers, particularly, may well have drawn comfort from the fact that the fraternity offered support for the widows and children of fallen brothers. How much brothers were able to draw on their lodges for spiritual comfort during the war, however, is debatable. As with civilian lodges whose work was disrupted by the war, lodges within the regiments also suffered. In peacetime, they might face disruptions as men were transferred. In open warfare, lodges were frequently disrupted by the necessities of executing the conflict itself. Men could not practice Masonry while they were in the field. The effect of disease, death, and perhaps even desertion also presented serious challenges to their regular work. There was something else important, I believe, offered by the fraternity for the soldier. In fact, offered by the fraternity for military life in general. In one sense, we can glimpse this in the appealing intent of the lodges, in their emphasis on respectability, sobriety, and personal development, both spiritual and intellectual. At this time, during the War of 1812, and for almost a century before, these sorts of associations between manly respectability and the military were very thin on the ground. Yet they were eagerly sought by those attempting to reform public opinion of Army life or Navy life, whether to redeem its current members or to attract new ones. For much of the 18th and early 19th century, popular opinion of the Army and Navy suffered from a general picture, which is painted most acutely by the London newspaper Spy, that soldiers were, quote, generally beloved by two sorts of companions, whores and lice. Both these vermin are great admirers of a scarlet coat. I like that one. Military service was seen as the last resort of the feckless, the drunken, and the hopelessly licentious. And as one British officer lamented early in the 19th century, a red coat was but little recommendation anywhere. In the United States, similar opinions abounded, and most people believed that there was little respectability in the work of soldiering. While Dr. James Mann, who was an Army surgeon and a Freemason during the war, described soldiers as, quote, that valuable and most necessary class of citizens employed to protect the rights of the nation, end quote, recruiters were often hard-pressed to find men whose motives for enlistment ran deeper than their desire to fill their pockets with the bounty they received for signing up. Bounties which these officers, of course, lamented were too often spent on booze. Drink was often perceived to be the main attraction at regular militia musters as well throughout the late 18th and early 19th century, which is what you see depicted in this particular painting. Many officers and career soldiers worked hard to change this impression, or through their own visible examples, to demonstrate its inaccuracy. Across the empire, throughout the United States, if men were looking for it, they could find recreation in gambling, drinking, as you see here in this is a camp from Ohio around 1812. Oh. They could also find recreation in fighting and whoring. But despite common opinion of the soldier's life, many of them sought something more respectable, more challenging, more in keeping with then current visions of the content of manliness, a manliness that pointed to the importance of sensibility, manners, gracious intellect, and understanding. For all of these things, Freemasonry was a proverbial hothouse. There was indeed a symmetry of experience for the Mason and the soldier. Both experienced initiation and training to enter into a culture that demanded secrecy, loyalty, and tests of physical strength. Both lodge and regiment were steeped in ritual and public display, in the performance of honor. Both required obedience to a set of rules that reflected the principles of loyalty and manliness for which the men worked and fought. We might look for examples of this symmetry to the symbiotic language of regiment and lodge when men misbehaved. In March of 1814, for example, two soldiers in barracks at Quebec, likely drunk, likely suffering spring fever after a long, cramped winter, quarreled and eventually inspired a riot. Sir George Prevost, who I believe was a Freemason, he certainly participated quite publicly in a number of Masonic events and ceremonies throughout the colonies. He proclaimed that the men involved displayed what he called a most disgraceful breach of discipline in acts of outrage derogatory to the character of a soldier. Their behavior reflected badly on the entire army, on the entire organization. Shortly after the war, two brothers of the lodge at Bath engaged in a quarrel, and while it did not result in a riot that I know of, members of the Grand Lodge declared in a language that Prevost would surely have agreed to that they were, quote, compelled to demand justice upon any brother who so far forgets himself as by his conduct to disgrace the whole body, end quote. Men whose unbecoming conduct outside the lodge room threatened to diminish public opinion of the lodge were frequently expelled or censured, as also occurred in the military. In both cases, membership was not just an individual experience, but a communal one, wherein certain principles and behaviors, reflective of their understanding of honor, self-control, and moral strength, were not only indicative of the quality of the individual, but the quality of the entire group. For these reasons, both Masons and the military enforced, wherever practical, which was admittedly much easier for the Freemasons in the early 19th century, strict rules of entry into their fraternities. 18th and early 19th century Masons, for example, rejected outright the admission of slaves, criminals, those with immoral characters, which often included those caught, as the lodge at Grimsby described it, as being too often disguised in drink. Eunuchs and the disabled, certainly men who were physically disabled, were not accepted into the military either, or were discharged when they became so. For both, strength of body and strength of mind were essential for the performance and the expression of their jobs, of their manhood. Desperation for bodies during conflicts like the War of 1812 meant that armies and navies could not be so picky. But listening to the complaints of commanding officers, many of whom were Freemasons, one gets the impression that they would certainly have preferred to be a bit more exclusive in recruiting men to their service, as Freemasons were to theirs. This is one of the central ironies of the Masonic experience in the early 19th century, in fact. While members claimed to celebrate and embrace notions of a universal brotherly love, they remained at the same time keen to distance themselves from those who were not brothers, those who did not meet the standards of initiation, whose personal lives, whose bodies, and public personas did not display the qualities of manhood considered essential for membership. In regimental Masonic lodges, too, these restrictions were put in place. Not every member of a regiment became a member of a lodge, nor were they even all eligible. By the 19th century, new regulations prevented the admittance of privates, underlining and emphasizing the importance of respectability. Respectability was something that officers had proven by their social standing at the time of their commission or through their successful promotion through the ranks. In one final respect, Masonry and military life were analogous, and that was their emphasis on the importance of political loyalty, on the dedication of body and soul to the protection of the lawfully established governments under which brothers found themselves living. In both American and British lodges, this principle was apparent. In one sense, it is a principle that appears to contradict the Constitution of Freemasonry itself, whose charges to its members prohibited the entry of politics into the lodge room. This prohibition, in fact, is operative in those moments when men on opposite sides of the war ignored their status as enemies and provided safety, assistance, and even escape. The lodge room was supposed to be politically neutral. The brothers were to approach one another on the level without regard to political differences. And clearly they did this sometimes outside of the lodge. However, in the wake of major violent upheavals and revolutions throughout the 18th century, in the wake of powerful government anxieties about sedition, secrecy, and treasonous plots against their authority, Masonic lodges could not afford to remain so politically neutral. In England, for example, the Unlawful Societies Act of 1799 outlawed all organizations which took, as they put it, unlawful oaths and engagements of fidelity and secrecy. Organizations which used secret signs and appointed committees, secretaries, and other officers in a secret manner, which certainly the Freemasons did. In order to avoid censure and disbandment, the Grand Lodges publicly declared that while, yes, they did these things, they were not done to challenge the government. In fact, they drew a self-portrait of extraordinary devotion and love for the king and the Constitution. Loyalty was an essential component of worthy manhood, and so it was an essential component of Freemasonry. To be loyal was not to be political, it was to be a good citizen. In Quebec, for example, the provincial Grand Master declared that membership in the fraternity bound the brethren collectively and individually to demonstrate loyalty to the king and obedience to his laws. While the situation was different in the United States, understandably, they had kind of gotten rid of the king, the basic outcome was the same. There was public worry and great concern about their secrecy, but Freemasons presented themselves and considered themselves throughout this entire period to be loyal subjects, promoters and protectors of the Republic. These political realities introduce a very interesting wrinkle to the experience of Masonry during the War of 1812. Because it was a war in which brothers found themselves at arms against each other so frequently, as they also did during the American Revolution and the Napoleonic conflict. On one hand, the demands of loyalty, the demands of their oaths and occupation as soldiers, defined brothers on the other side of the line as enemies. On the other, the demands of their fraternal oaths required that they give aid and support to their fellow Masons wherever in the world they found them, and perhaps even in battle. It's clear for many Masons that this tension, the realization that they were at war with their fellow brothers, was an emotionally disturbing one. We can return, for example, to late May of 1813, during that ultimately successful American bid to capture Fort George. The troops, incidentally, were under the command of Brigadier General Morgan Lewis, who some of you may have heard of before. He was a Freemason, and later the governor of New York, as well as the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge at New York. And among his men were many more Masonic brothers, including Captain John T. Arrowsmith of the 6th Regiment of Infantry. As Arrowsmith led his men up the lakeshore toward the fort, they came across a wounded British soldier. Clearly, this officer thought he was about to find himself with a bayonet in his chest, and in desperation, unable to move himself out of danger, he did what the American soldier did at Beaver Dams. He gave what a later chronicler described as the soul-thrilling appeal of a Mason. Upon witnessing this sign, Arrowsmith felt, as he described it, as if the hairs on my head stood upright and held my hat off my head. A clear indication, surely, of the sudden shock that he and countless other officers felt when they recognized their supposed enemies in the context of friendship. And Arrowsmith, as Clement had done before, saved this man's life, and they later became friends. In fact, they became friends because Arrowsmith got wounded and they were in the same hospital together. As this and the examples given at the beginning of my talk demonstrate, there were certainly Masons who set the demands of the Brotherhood above the demands of the war. But there were not so many incidences like these to suggest that all Masons behaved this way. Outside the lodge room, politics and political loyalty often did trump the oaths of brotherhood. Here's where an examination of Masons' roles during the war is an unflattering one. In some of the most violent actions, we know that Freemasons were present. They were a strong presence, in fact, in all theaters of the conflict. They looted, they pillaged, they burned their way across the landscape along with the men in their regiments. On the battlefields, they fought ferociously. Sometimes, most of the time, their behavior was ignored. Behaviors abhorrent to peacetime, abhorrent to the principles of Freemasonry, were normal, loosely speaking, if not necessary, during war. Sometimes, though, a Mason would find himself on the receiving end of a rebuke for his disregard of Masonic ties. When Brother William Hull invaded Canada in July of 1812, he and his men proceeded to set up their camp at the home of François Babby, the man you see on the left here. Babby was a prominent local businessman, a politician, and I strongly suspect also a Freemason. He and Hull had been very friendly before the war. This is one of those places where there was a great deal of cross-border visiting between lodges. And so Babby was horrified to discover that Hull had permitted his soldiers to ruin his house, to cut down his fruit trees, and otherwise destroy or pillage his belongings. When he confronted Hull, the latter reportedly replied, simply, "Times have changed." When, only a few weeks later, Hull suffered his ignominious defeat at Fort Detroit, surrendering to Isaac Brock without firing a shot, he and his officers were paraded across Upper Canada and into Quebec on public display. Babby, according to one account, went over to see the disgraced general in General Brock's tent where he was being held. "Well, General," says he, "circumstances are changed now indeed." This friendship was never repaired. Hull was court-martialed and found guilty of cowardice and treason. He escaped execution when he was later pardoned out of respect for his services during the American Revolution, but he lived in obscurity thereafter, and his Masonic past is rather less subtly proclaimed than the past of others who participated in this war. That Hull's Masonic identity is downplayed, in some sources, in fact, it is completely ignored, should not be surprising. His behavior at Detroit, and not simply his surrender, but the manner in which he later cast blame on his officers and his government, his apparent lack of sobriety, his lack of dignity and strength, were traits which set him outside the principles expected of a member of the craft. His inability to live the tenets of Masonic teaching meant he was less a man because he was less a Mason. An echo of this process happened frequently during the War of 1812 and in its aftermath, when important military figures were held out by Masonic orators as exemplars of the craft, even when their status as Masons is in question, and even was in question. However, these figures were exemplars of manliness whose lives illustrated how the work of Masonry might and should guide everyday behavior. Presbyterian minister and Freemason William Smart, for example, told the story of a particularly heroic general during the war during a sermon in 1813. This man, he told his listeners, was both honorable and wise. He exercised his authority with moderation, and through his visible loyalty, the inhabitants of the province soon became united as the heart of one man in the cause of our king and country. As occurred within the lodge, this man demonstrated, Smart said, the necessity of ignoring religious bigotry and, as he called it, those party disputes which are so warmly contended for by little minds. He was a man who aspired to larger objects. He possessed vast knowledge which inspired him and those around him to sobriety, morality, and good order. He treated all men, whether the savages with whom he fought or the soldiers and officers who he fought against, with level humanity and benevolence. His character, Smart insisted, ought to guide the motives of all men during the awful visitation of war and in the ultimate peace which would emerge from it. He was writing, as some of you may have guessed, about Sir Isaac Brock. This was a man that many claim was initiated into the craft, but many more claim, for want of direct evidence, that he was not. Over the past few years, as I have set out to explore the meaning of Freemasonry in the context of this war, the question of whether Brock was or was not a Mason has been frequently put to me. My answer, to borrow a phrase from the Mythbusters, is that it's plausible but not confirmed. However, I also believe that a definitive answer to this question is less important than the question itself. Why should it matter? Why did it matter to Freemasons themselves if he was a member of the lodge or not? And what can their desire to claim him as a brother tell us about the practice of the craft as a whole? It mattered, surely, to the Masons who participated very prominently in laying with full Masonic orders the cornerstone of Brock's first monument in 1824. It mattered because he was the sort of man who fulfilled the expectations the craft held for the performance and the expression of manhood. Their efforts reflect the essence of what I've come to understand about the connections between Masonry and military experience, about the ways these two realms reflected and reinforced one another. Freemasonry, as I've noted, was a fraternity whose core activities worked to improve the man spiritually, morally, and intellectually. This was a project set into an historical context which demanded that men also demonstrate strength, bravery, and loyalty, qualities promoted and necessary, particularly in military circles. Throughout the 18th and into the early 19th century, these loyalties and these strengths were put to the test on battlefields across Europe and North America, and tied the men of the lodge with the men of the sword inextricably. As the experience of war taught many of these brothers, the politics so carefully extracted from the lodge room were something they had to contend with outside of it. And in the performance of the war, their ability to exercise the teachings of the craft amidst the chaos all around them, the players in that drama were being disabled, killed, or ruined by disease, was an extraordinary challenge. Some of them rose to that challenge by defying the scripts that defined how the war was to be played. Some of them, perhaps more than less, envisioned Masonic teachings as something better directed at the protection of their nation than their foreign brothers. Between 1812 and 1815, over 20,000 combatants died in the conflict that we call the War of 1812. Civilians found their homes ruined, their communities in ashes, and the recovery took decades to build. The ranks of Masonic lodges, as the ranks of the armies and navies on both sides of the war, were steadily depleted by death, disease, and destruction. And it was sometimes many years before the easy camaraderie of pre-war Masonic visits returned to normal. Even in peace, and despite the admonition to leave politics at the door, the legacy of the war haunted the lodge room and, as it did for civilians, altered forever their impressions of their neighbors. This highlights the fact that the War of 1812 was not so much a war fought over a border as it was one which defined that border. Today, however, I hope some reflection on this conflict can instruct us about the value of forgetting its existence, as the brethren did for so long before war disrupted their easy travel across it. And I should like to close this lecture as they closed their lodges in love and harmony. Thank you.